And to you, sir.
Hello, my name's David Pichilingi. I'm delighted to be doing this interview with Tony. Um, I've spent the best part of my life working in the music business, and I always think it's best to steal a line that David Bowie always had when he said, "I'm a generalist, not a specialist." I've worked in most areas of the music business over the past 40 years, and I think my greatest skill is my ears, and I think surrounding myself with great people. But I'm very happy to talk about everything I've done.
Excuse me. Well, where do we begin? Now, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Dave, you were kind of a musician. There's a lot of similarities in as much as obviously I refer to myself as an adopted Yank, always a Manc, you know. So we come from both sides of the M62. Um, but didn't you start playing in bands? I mean, as a first kind of entry route, so to speak.
I did. I think a lot of people from my generation started in bands really because there were no programs to learn about what the music industry was about. I think in those days it was the Donald Passman book, everything you always wanted to know about the music business. I think anybody who wanted to learn about basic contracts read that. But like many people, as a young 15-year-old lad coming from the other end of the M62 from Liverpool, it was I was never going to be a football player. I was never going to be a boxer. So music, had always been appealing to me because my mum was a cabaret singer. And so it felt like music was always in our home, whether being played on records, my mum learning music or singing. Um, and so it seemed like to me the obvious choice really to join a band. It was a great time to do it as well, a very exciting time in the mid to late 70s because obviously punk rock happened. And so it felt possible, really. It felt like anybody could have a go at it, really. And so my entry point, like many, many, many other people who I know who work in this business, was starting off, yeah, in a band singing.
Yeah, well, my kind of journey in was I was in a band in my teenage years because, like, you know, when you're 14, you want to play in Manchester, you want to play for Man United, then maybe Man City now, but we won't go there. Um, and then kind of I got in a band, but I got in a band because I had the largest room for us to rehearse in, you know. And then I realized I was a crap bass player, so I politely resigned to become manager of a band that didn't have any gigs or a record contract, which was
Yeah.
an easy gig to do. But I always think with the music industry, Dave, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, it's not how to do business. There's no two bands are alike, no two labels are alike, no two managers are alike. And like myself, you've kind of learned a lot along the way from the people that have been around you. I mean, one name that kind of springs to mind immediately from, you know, when I started in the 70s selling records to places like Probe Records and stuff in Liverpool, you know, was a guy called Roger Eagle, who is
Mm,
quite kind of, you know, sadly passed away a long time ago. I got
mm.
to know him when he moved to Manchester. He looked after the international, of course. But Roger was a visionary, wasn't he? Before the kind of the word existed, I think.
He was, and obviously he was a man lad. He came from your end, but had a huge influence on the Liverpool scene. Before punk, even I think the jazz scene really, because he was heavily into his jazz and his dub, into his dub music, and so was very responsible, along with Probe Records and Jeff from Probe. Um, I guess providing the landscape for us to kind of do our apprenticeships really. And so Eric's that Roger and Pete Fulwell were responsible for opening was a place that you could go and see for very nominal fees. And I was a little bit younger, so I had to go to the matinees at Eric's. So my mum would want me home by about 6, half 6 at night. So on a Saturday, mainly Saturdays, I'd go to the matinees at Eric's and buy my records from Probe. And Roger, going back to ears, really had a wonderful um, knowledge of music, of popular music, and also great ears, and so was really booking all of the acts and the artists that were coming through on that kind of very very early punk scene for Eric's. So you got to see all of these bands then, and you got to go to Probe and be insulted by the staff. Maybe the choice of records that you were buying, really, and they'd look at you disdainfully, whilst they prize the money out your hand, really, if you were choosing the wrong records, really. So it was a great time to be young, really. I think, and that's not to say it's not now, because I always hate it when people of my age always say that my rock and roll was cooler than your rock and roll because I don't think that's true. It was just great to be young. I think being young was the thing really, and it gave you the opportunity, seeing these bands and hearing these records to think, you know what, I can have a go at this as well. Really, like you, I didn't even try and play the bass or the guitar. I was too lazy, and also no patience. I think if I can't learn something in 10 minutes, then I'm bored, really, And so I decided that I would be the singer, really.
Mm.
Um, for no other reason than my mum had been a singer and she'd always had us getting up in competitions at Butlins and Pontins and places like that, singing. So I thought, I'll have a go at doing that. Um, but yeah, I think mentors and people that are responsible for the way for the path that you took are very, very important. And so people like Roger, who I never ever met formally, actually, because he died when I was, when I was still quite young, really, sadly. But again, mentors have played a huge part in my life post that and to this day, really,
Yeah, I think both Liverpool and Manchester was kind of there's a certain attitude there with it, like, we can do this, let's get on with it, and obviously you've got connections with Factory Records, we'll get into that in a bit. But I think the thing is, I started out like in 1974, and my story was like, I was kind of I went to further education college, which was perfect for people like me. I was done with school, but not ready for work. It wasn't to say that I was ambitious, so I got myself a job, which was a crap job. And then all of a sudden, I saw an ad in the paper, in the Manchester Evening News, put in there accidentally. It should have been in Music Week for a sales rep for Transatlantic. I was buying Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin records. I wasn't like, I had hair then. And and I thought, well, I don't have a job in the music business. If I don't get it, I still don't have a job. So I started selling records at the back of a van for £25 a week. But I learnt my trade like on the street, like the boxer in the ghetto. You don't go to rehearsals to kind of learn this and that. You kind of fight your way through it. But I
You do.
always, I always, from my point of view, I always feel myself, dare I use the word privilege, that I worked in the industry and I learned from, my mentors were the Chris Blackwells and the Armour Dirtigans. They were the music people. They weren't the accountants and the lawyers. And I'm not putting a downer on it type things, but
Oh, I know
things
what you mean.
changed. Do you know what I mean? And if we don't have time this time, I'd love to have you back to talk about your label and kind of what you've managed to do with that, because I find that absolutely incredible that you can kind of, you know, do this, do that, and not only if we go back to you being in a band, Dave, you actually had a record contract, which is a bit different to like 99% of the people who are in bands in the north of England back in the day, even now.
It took a long time. I mean, like I said, I was in bands from 15 years of age, and I signed a record deal, I think, when I was about 25. And like you said, really, there was no formal network like the MMF or anything like that. You didn't know who managers were, really. They were these mysterious people. So I took it upon myself to be the manager of our own band, really. And I think I was pretty good at that. I've always been good at relationships, in terms of get not just getting on with people. I think it's more than that. Um, but being able to navigate my way with kind of street people through to suit people and everyone in between, really. And so I was pretty good at that. And so we built a kind of reputation for the band I was in until in the end we signed with RCA Records. It was Corda Marshall, actually, who to this day remains a friend, who signed us to RCA. But before that, I'd kind of because I was pretty good at managing my own band, I'd ended up being asked to manage another band, and so I managed another band in Liverpool called The Farm,
Oh
and
yeah,
I started managing them again quite early. Simon Moran, famously, the first gig that
yeah.
he ever put on was a Farm gig in Sheffield, which I wasn't involved with, but I knew Simon not long after that. And Simon was always very impressed about the way I was managing my own band at that time. And he gave us some shows together. My band at that time was a band called Wake Up Africa and The Farm. And so I became close friends with them and subsequently ended up managing The Farm as well. And then we formed the record label towards the back end of the 80s called Produce Records, which was funded actually by the grandson of John Moores, who was the Little Woods Pools multi-millionaire guy. And so again, that's a great story in itself. But we end up forming this label with money from the Moores family. And that was because the Farm had seen bands like the Happy Mondays, who they'd played with, and everyone else go on to great success via Factory, and a lot of other bands through independent labels. And so we thought we'd try and emulate that, and we had great success, to be honest, with that first Farm album. We had a number one, and we. It's one of those weird things about learning it as you do it. I don't quite know how we did it. We had great songs. We had a lot of ambition, a lot of arrogance, I guess, at that time, and so on. And and it just the culmination was a huge success with the Farm for their singles and for their album. So much so that I'd almost forgotten I was in a band myself, but somewhere deep inside me, I still wanted a record deal myself, really. And so that resulted with me meeting a lot more people in the business, and as a consequence of that, eventually signing a record deal with RCA via Corder Marshall, which didn't last for very long. I think it lasted for about 18 months. We were dropped from a great height, but what it had given me was an appetite to know I could make money from this business, and also I'd kind of wedged the door open really because now I knew a lot of people in the business and now I knew a way. I could see the path almost really. My plan always changed, but at least I had a way in really, and I had a way to kind of reach people who had money and to be able to do some of the things that I saw in my head at that time.
Yeah, I'm loving this, Dave. This is a great story. I mean, we could do it like 2 hours, but don't worry. Did you find people like, as you were kind of, not to be, disrespectful, kind of growing up in the industry, did you find people like Tony Wilson, great curiosity with people like Tony Wilson, Rob Gretton and stuff? Because obviously they're my hometown. I
Yeah,
promoted their records for 10 years, but I do have an affiliation with Liverpool because I did Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Julian Cope, the Christians. So people that you mentioned, like Pete Fullway, Pete's passed away, has he?
he passed away a few years ago, sadly. Yeah,
Yeah, I only found out that I don't know about talking to. I think
yeah,
I was talking
it
to
was a very
Nasha,
quiet affair, sadly. Yeah,
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 because we
yeah.
had Nasha and McNabb on the program, because like I say, it's good to kind of, the thing is like with like I go back to that kind of attitude thing, that belief in thing, I can do this, I don't need to learn anything or something. It's not, I don't think it's more arrogance than kind of like confidence in your own
Yeah, it's quite
ability.
a confidence. It's not a cocky arrogance. It's a northern arrogance, I think, in some
Yeah.
ways. Liverpool and Manchester kind of share that. And going back to what you said about, I mean, Rob at that point, obviously, I'd heard of Rob at that time because of Joy Division, and you knew he was the manager and so on. Um, and we all knew Tony because he was on the telly, really. He was the fella on the telly, and so you kind of just knew him as that and the guy that ran Factory. I mean, now it's hard. People say, "Oh, you must have always known he was charismatic," but it wasn't. He wasn't at that time. Certainly, that wasn't our knowledge of him. Really, we kind of liked him because he kind of the way he built up that Liverpool Manchester thing. There was a funniness about it. There was a sarcasm that even we embraced, really. And I always remember Yvette telling me, and Tony, he loved Liverpool and he loved Liverpool people, and he loved that kind of competitive streak.
But
But
he
it was a
also
little
loved
bit
winding them
down.
up, didn't he?
Oh, he loved it, and he was
Yeah, he
great.
loved it.
And to be fair, Tony got a lot of stick himself. I mean, you'll have walked with him like I did on a few occasions through the centre of Manchester, and he's hailed as a god there now. And people will be shouting, "Fuck off, Tony!" You cunt," whatever, and all kinds of stuff on him. And he just let it brush off him like water off a duck's back. Really, it didn't really bother him. Really, I think he kind of liked the attention, whether it was good or bad. He liked the attention that he got. Really. Um, but I worked with him on In the City with Phil Sachs, and I got to know Tony very very well then, and I got to know Rob pretty well as well before he died because I ended up co-managing a band called Sub Sub
Yeah,
with
I
Dave.
promoted him.
Yeah, that's right. You were doing the promo at that time, so I managed a girl called Nina Henshin, who ended up being the vocalist on the album, and Dave Rowe managed the band, and so I worked with Rob and with Dave, on that all of that campaign and with on that album. And I found Rob absolutely fascinating. Again, that humor, that dark, sarcastic humor, was evident with Rob as well. But just in terms of again of his knowledge of music and his love of music and his vision um, for things, really, that was a lot of it was in his head, but my God, when you got him to get that stuff out of his head, it was absolutely fantastic, really. And so both Tony and Rob ended up playing quite. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Just going to turn that phone off.
No
Sorry.
problem.
So I'll go back on that. Plus, Tony and Rob end up playing quite a huge influence on me in terms of the way I approach things and the kind of the way I looked at the industry really and not took it too seriously.
Yeah, I think the great thing about the one thing I found like I mean Liverpool did do that later on, but the thing is if you go back way back to like the Beatles and stuff, you had to kind of move to London, Whereas like if it's Simply Red or New Order and you want to meet and get on a train and come up here. I went through that whole kind of sad period with factory as well, when they kind of, closed down. I had my accountant like telling me to issue winding up orders. I said, these are my friends. So we went down for like 17 grand, in money that was owed. And I was just kind of sending records out. But, Tony was a great listener as well, because I played cricket for the Granada team because I think there's the only one that could play cricket. And I remember having a tea interval with Tony at Hale. Most people are drinking, in Cheshire countryside, drinking cups of tea, and Tony was rolling a spliff. And I'm sat down talking to him, and this new order track, Blue Monday. And I don't know if you remember, but there was that program on Hyping on World in Action. And I said to Tony, I was working at Island Records at the time. I said, "Give me a box of records, I'll drop them off. They're paying my petrol and everything. I'll take them round."
Tony,
Um,
do you mind if I just get the door quickly?
no, not at all. I can edit all this out. Don't worry, Dave.
Sorry about that. Give me
No
2 minutes.
problems, mate.
I'm sorry about that, Tony. We've got the gardeners in. My wife's left me with instructions or what they're meant to be doing to some trees and all this kind of stuff,
Rock and
So
roll, eh?
exactly, exactly. But anyway, there we go. Yeah.
Um, so where were we? We are talking about factory and stuff. So yeah, just to finish off, I don't want to ramble on about me, but I remember kind of, telling Blue Monday that, which was kind of, when you're a plugger, as in, PR, you don't have to say to people, you need to give it a few listens to get into it. First time it's like, oh my God, this is incredible. I always consider it almost like the first house record, by a kind of, band from Manchester type
I
thing.
mean, that was hugely that record was hugely influential, and I think just the story of the sleeve and everything else that goes with it just mythologizes it even more. Really, it was it was a monumental record, and I think you look at the influence that Joy Division had on a legion of bands, in the same way as the VU did in the late '60s, early '70s. I think that record, Joy Division and certainly early New Order was just inspired a
Yeah.
legion of people to join bands and everything else. You can feel the DNA of those records in music to this
I
day.
also, I also love the fact that when Ian passed away in Curtis, there was no Joy Division. It reminded me, not musically, but in the same way as Led Zeppelin. Without John Bonham, there's no Led Zeppelin. So
No,
without Ian Curtis, then Joy Division was done because the singer, was no longer alive. So they moved on and they created another band, completely kind of different and exploded, but had the confidence to do it and the support of the label.
yeah,
And Factories goes kind of deep in my soul. I mean, I managed Hooky after he left New Order, Revenge and stuff.
yeah.
Well, but I had a sabbatical first of all, so that's when I got to realize that management was actually a worse job than plugging. But
Yes,
Tony's loyalty to Hooky was amazing. You know, the fact that, he'd helped bring the label through and stuff. And also with people like Rob and even going back to the Martin Hanners, I mean, it's sadly because we're talking about all these people who are no longer around,
no,
and
it's right. Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
absolutely.
kind of, you learn from everybody, and like my experience with the New Order thing was, telling Tony to give me some records and I'd drop them off with DJs. I said, listen, they're not going to go out and buy them. He said, well, we don't kind of do that. I said, what do you mean? He said, that kind of world in action hyping thing, the whole payola thing was huge in the States. I looked at him,
Yeah,
I said, what? He said, well, yeah. I said, listen, do you put your records in the stores? He said, yeah. I said, you put a gun to people's heads and make them buy them. He said no. I said, give me some box of fucking records. I'll go round and drop them off. Not
yeah,
that I broke the record. It was just a no-brainer. A lot of those DJs were going to listen to stuff that I gave them. Anyway, I digress. One thing
yeah.
I do want to bring up in part one of Dave Pichilingi is I was listening to something, a great interview you did with the Cavern guy. And you talked
Oh, with
about
John.
Tim
Yeah.
Hudson. Would you believe?
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember his name, but Dave, they put a record out. And I actually played a cricket match at Birtles.
Yeah, we played there. We played one of his things at Bertels's Bowl, yeah.
Yeah.
Because he used to cultivate these magic mushrooms on his land. I don't know whether he did it on purpose, but he had tens of thousands. We used to get off our cakes on these magic mushrooms that was on his land, and we'd stay in that lovely, beautiful mansion house that he had at the time and swim in that pool he had outside.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
It was
and so Tim ended up managing us for a brief time. That was my other band before I signed to RCA, the Wake Up Africa band I talked about. And what a guy he was,
how did it fall
I
upon him
actually
then?
met him. I actually met him through Jeremy Lascelles
Oh,
because I got to meet Jeremy through the farm, through my days of running produce records, and then I think I was in London at one point, and Jeremy I think I was in company with him and a few other people, and he was asking. Tim was there, and he said, "Can you play cricket and all this kind of stuff?" I said, "No, I'm not really a cricketer." I said, "But the band, that I was in, said we'd love to play this land because it sounded phenomenal." He said he had live music there. So I think the first year we played there, it was ourselves and China Crisis played on Bertels's Bowl, and Jeremy Lascelles would have his kind of cricket team. I think Virgin's cricket team at that time playing the Bertels. Tim Hudson's, however many playing a cricket team, I don't know.
11.
Um, but yeah, Tim Hudson's 11 then, and so that was my introduction to the mad world of Tim Hudson and the kind of things that the stories that guy would tell us. And at first when he told me, I met him in Manchester and in London, and he told me these stories, and I thought, these are, they felt like tall tales to some extent because he was great at telling the story. And it was only when you got to his house, his home, and you saw all of these photos with him with a ewer interviewing John Lennon and interviewing Paul McCartney on that first American tour and so on. You thought, fucking hell, this wasn't bullshit. This is all real. It
He
was
was
all.
kind of a hustler before the word existed,
He was
wasn't
an
he?
absolute hustler. Yeah, I mean, he came from, it was a textile thing that he came from with his dad, and he ended up accidentally, I think, because of time and place. Really, he ended up mates with the Beatles. He ended up kind of packing everything in and just going to live in the States and calling himself a lord. He just called himself
Yeah.
Lord Hudson. Really, just made up the whole thing. Really, but days before the internet and so on, you could get away with all that kind of stuff then, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I think wasn't he a DJ out in
He
California?
was. He was a DJ. He worked for a company out in LA. I can't remember which one now, but that was the reason because yeah, it was his program was the Lord Tim Hudson Show, giving music kind of Anglophile, playing all the British invasion music of the time. And so his boss said to him at the time, "You need to. Oh, your mates, the Beatles, are coming over. You need to get an interview with them. And he thought, "Fuck, what am I going to do? I've not seen them for years."
Mm.
He met them buying them coffee in Liverpool before their Hamburg days even. And so he blagged his way into the restaurant. He knew they were in New York. He booked a table in there, waltzed over to the table as he tells the story. And John Lennon's there, and security were kind of stopping him walking over. And John Lennon looks up and he goes, "Oh, it's the Manc. Let him in." And so he said, "What are you doing here?" And he goes, "Well, I've got to ask you a massive favor." He said, "It's my job's on the line. I've told everyone you're my best mate." And
I love it.
I'm going to do the tour. And he went, yeah, no problem. He said, we're not having any journalists on the tour. He said, but you can do it. So that was it. He got the gig and he did the whole of that first American tour with the Beatles.
That's
Uh,
incredible. I mean, when you
yeah.
look back at that time, that was a super exciting time in the
But,
industry, wasn't it?
Scousers and Manx again, on the hustle
Yeah,
all the time,
yeah.
really.
And
It's
also,
a great story.
like I said, I want to hear a lot more about, your label and Sound City and everything like that. But we won't have time to do that now. So we'll stick
No,
into
that's
like,
fine.
the kind of the early days of Dave Pichilingi. So I suppose in a way, like though we won't go into it deeper on this one, the idea of Sound City was kind of replacing in the city, was it? Because obviously that sadly passed away.
Yeah, it was. Like I said, I'd worked with Tony for a number of years, primarily bringing sponsors in, and alongside Phil Sachs. Phil Sachs was like the A&R for In the
Yeah.
City, in the same way as he was for Factory. And so my role was really to bring in a lot of the sponsors and so on, because there wasn't really anyone that was experienced with that, and nor was I really. But it just goes back to that thing of hustling, being able to hold a conversation, trying to understand what people's needs were, all that kind of stuff. And so I'd been quite successful at bringing in a number of partners on In the City. And then sadly, Tony got ill, and as we all know, died not too long after that. Actually, it was a relatively short illness,
Mm.
you know. And so when he went, I was asked by Yvette to carry on working for In the City. And at that time, I'd been to South by Southwest. And I always remember South by Southwest had been coming to In the City for a number of years. And we'd just been fairly dismissive of them, really. These people in Texas, what's that all about? And then when I went and seen it firsthand, I saw, wow, you could see the potential in it at that time. And so I came back and I thought, you know what? In the City feels over for now. It's a bit like the Curtis thing, really. Tony
Yeah,
was
yeah.
he was the front man of In the City. He was the ambassador. He was the voice. He was the spokesperson. But he had some good people around him. But it was Tony, really, Tony and Yvette. But it was Tony's drive and his personality that had kind of got it to where it got it. And so I just thought it's over this. And I think also technology, MySpace had come. And so that kind of killed the model of In the City of 54 bands that you've never heard before, because all of a sudden all the A&R people had heard the bands. And so they stopped coming up to Manchester or to Ireland or wherever else we'd done it, because they knew who the bands were, really. So they didn't have to. So you could almost feel it dying slowly. And so I thought, I don't want to be part of something that's dying very, very
Mm.
slowly like that. So I decided to start something in Liverpool. And I went to meet Yvette in the Lowry Hotel. I always remember it. We went and had some lunch together, because I thought, I want to tell her one on one. I don't want to call her on the phone. I want to have the
Yeah.
respect to speak to her face to face. And I said, look, I'm not continuing for In the City, and I'm going to start a new thing. I don't think I had a name for it then. I said, but I'm going to start a new thing in Liverpool. I'm probably going to start it in 12 months' time. I'm going to position it away from In the City, so I'll do it early on in the year, so it won't challenge, In the City. Really, I said, in my head, if you can get In the City back to where it should have been, we can complement each other, really, and do that. And she looked at me and she goes, if Tony was here, he'd call you a cunt. I said, Tony used to always call me a cunt anyway. I saw it as a term of endearment, really, at the time. Um, I said, but I'm sorry you feel that way, but I just don't want to carry on, doing this. Anyway, that was the way we parted. And then about 12 months later, Yvette did get in touch with me and said, look, I've heard good things about what you're doing. We're probably not going to do In the City for much longer at that time. She brought somebody else in to do it. Anyway, she was really quite gracious and really nice about the fact what I was doing at that point, really. So it kind of squared the circle for me in many ways, because I don't like. Listen, I always say, even to the artists you work with, for every 100 people that like you over there, there's 10 gonna dislike you or hate you even over there. But as long as you can sleep at night is the thing,
Yeah.
really. As long as you feel like you've not done anyone any malice or any harm, really. But that's always been the way I've carried everything forward, and to this day, I think that's still the way I go about my business. So I was really pleased when Yvette came back to me and said,
Yeah,
like,
that's great. No,
there's
that's
no
really
malice,
respectful, and
you
also
know.
the fact that you'd be beating yourself up if you didn't do it, because the fact that you made the decision to do it was you had the confidence in knowing it would work, I mean, looking back, it was funny because, like, having been there right from the beginning, from day one, with the connection with Tony and everything, there was a little amount of cynicism, because London never did the equivalent of South by Southwest, and that is the capital city where a lot of people would have congregated. And it took like Manchester and Tony Wilson and his vision to do that, to make it work. And the first one was kind of a certain amount of cynicism, dare I say, from the industry, so there was a good turnout. I mean, I did a lot of panels and I went to every single one of all the events that interested me and stuff. Even
Yeah,
people like Coldplay were discovered there.
yeah,
Um,
I know,
but
that's right.
the thing with it, Dave, was the fact that I remember the first one, there weren't any big industry people. The second in the city, because the word had got out, Maurice Oberstein, Chris Blackwell. I got the first time of, well, two times. Once was Dennis Law at Granada TV, and the other one was Peter Grant. The only time I've been vaguely starstruck, I've worked with a lot of big artists, but
Yeah,
past Dennis Law on the stairs at Granada TV, and I kind of trembled. And I
yeah,
was in the elevator with Peter Grant going up to sign in, and having grown
yeah,
up and listening to Zeppelin and stuff. And it was incredible because I remember that Ed Bicknell did a one on, or was it Tony? I'm not sure. I think it was Ed Bicknell talking to Peter Grant in one of the bigger rooms, and he asked him that, and I was like third row, and he asked him like, "Do you what did you feel like when John Bonham left? Were you going to consider going on with Led Zeppelin?" You could see the lump in his throat. And
yeah,
here's a guy who was a wrestling promoter and, like,
yeah,
would hang
that's right.
people out of balconies and fierce as a lion. And he said, and the lump in his throat, he said, and he was almost crying. He said, "Without John Bonham, there is no Led Zeppelin." And you hear Peter Grant's story about being a recluse after that, and it kind of destroyed him and destroyed the band. But for me, it remains in the rock annals as a moment in history. Whereas, and I've had this discussion with Hooky about the thing that worries me about the New Order thing with him going and things. I might be a little biased, I don't know, but without Peter Hook, there is no New Order. I worry about the legacy being left in place about a band like that were kind of, so kind of adored by so many. I mean,
Yeah,
I
no,
one thing I did, I worked with a band called Dogstar that Keanu Reeves was in. I took a guy out to LA to interview him, and I found out the other week that his hero is Peter Hook. That's why he picked up a bass, Keanu Reeves. So I immediately texted Hooky and said, "Oh, by the way, when you're in LA, do you fancy Keanu Reeves supporting you?" And it was like, "Oh yeah, hell yeah! I think I might be able to do something there." But that would be so cool. I could imagine them playing bass together, like. Anyway, I digress. We're going
yeah.
to run out of time soon, Dave. But without drifting into the label and everything like that, just going back on something that you said with do you feel? Did you ever feel that there was a time to get a grown-up's job?
Funny that. No, no, never, ever really. I think when I first left school, I my first job was in Ford's, because it was the era of Thatcher, and so I was well, I left school actually, and I was on a Margaret Thatcher training course, as they call them. I can't remember what the acronym was, but it was basically signing on the dole, but you had to go full time to college, and I did that, and then I ended up after a year of that getting into Ford's, and so there was a time where I thought Ford's might be for me because it was a good job really. I trained as a spark. I had an apprenticeship as an electrician,
Oh wow.
and so I did 3 years, and I always remember coming to my mum and dad and saying, "Look, um, because my Alfella was made up when I got a job in Ford's, because that was the dog's bollocks, really, to have a
Mm.
job there. It was they called them jobs for life in them days, really. And so I had that. So I was very pleased. He was very proud of that. But then I think within a year of it, of doing an apprenticeship, which I loved, and I'm still friends with some of the lads I work with in there to this day. What I realized was then when I finished my time, I'd have to go on shift work, which meant I would have had to go on nights, which meant I would have had to pack in being in a band because I was still in a band, making no money from this band whatsoever. But I still loved the lifestyle and I still had the dream and the ambition that one day I'd be a rock and roll star, really. So I remember going into my mum and dad and saying, "Look, I'm going to pack Fords in." And my mum went, "Pack it in." My mum was very impulsive in that way, but my dad said, "Why?" And I said, "Because of the shifts." And he went, "Well, can't you at least serve your time?" He said, "So the line at the time was, at least if you never make any money from the music business, you'll have something to fall back on. Uh,
Yeah.
so I like to think to this day I've never had to fall back on being a spark, because thankfully I've made an okay living from the business. And my wife would also say, I can't even change a plug these days. So thank God I didn't rely on that to put food on the table, really, because we probably wouldn't have earned very much money.
No, but what I sense is it's funny talking to you now. Like we spoke on the phone, but it's funny because of all those years we must have been in the same room a bunch of times. And
Well, we were all in the city times.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Right.
Also, your involvement with Lipper and stuff. We can leave that to part two.
Yeah,
We've only got a couple of minutes left. But what I wanted to say, Dave, was what I find just talking to you because that's why I like doing them face to face. Because it's like a fireside chat without the beer. Uh, but
yeah.
maybe we could do that next time. There must be a virtual beer sometime. But what I love about it is you've got that zest and enthusiasm that and I've said this when I've been on other people's podcasts promoting my book or stuff like that, and I said, I'm sorry, I go off a bit. And I said this, I said, but you know what? I don't want to lose that excitable child in me.
Oh, you don't. You've definitely still got that excitement
And
in you.
and to
People
the
say that to me, but I definitely see that in you,
yeah,
Tony.
the
You've still
working title of my book was called "Will You Shut the Fuck Up?" It's just like I just go off on a roll. And the thing with these things is that it's totally self-indulgent with the podcast because if I enjoy people's stories, why wouldn't other people? I mean, I did a show for 6.5 years back, 10.5 years back in Piccadilly. No, 12 and a half years, the last
Yeah,
radio
yeah,
program, playing a lot of up and coming bands from all over the place. And the only reason I did it was the fact that Radcliffe was living with me, Radcliffe, and he left. And I went in and banged on the program for Jules Dawn. It was like, what the fuck? And I have to roll off all the names of the bands from Graham Nash to Freddie and the Dreamers to 10cc right through. Do you know who comes from this city? I live in, I work here. Well, why don't you do it? Right, I will. My first three programs were Frankie Goes to Hollywood, U2, and New Order. Tony brought them
wow.
in. And they'd never been
That's
in the radio.
classic.
They all thought it was hilarious. But it was kind of the punk plugger in me. It's like I was trying to do something for the city, not for me.
Yeah,
But I find that thing that there's. I mean, I love that. I'm not being biased against Liverpool in any way, but I still have that bag. We're from Manchester. We do things differently here. I
yeah,
mean, I can see Tony saying that. And also
yeah. No,
pissing people off
absolutely.
while he was saying it.
And it's true, and I think Scousers are very much the same, really.
Yeah.
Our one is we're not English, we're Scouse.
Oh, we've
And
got we got finish on that one. That's great. Yeah.
um,
It's, and
and
we're
it's
gonna. We
I
sorry, Dave.
think,
We
and
got.
the other one I've said is because the I think it's what makes both the cities very great music cities and great football cities, because I think it's that competitiveness that
Exactly.
kind of drives that energy, really. And I remember Peter Hooton, I won't steal it and claim it as my own, but Peter Hooton once described it as a budgie peck in a mirror. You
Oh,
know,
love it.
he had the
Love it.
same thing, really. We just
Love
kind
it. We're going to call it a day there, Ted, because we're at less than a minute, and I hate getting cut off without saying goodbye. Thank you so much, Dave Pichilingi, for your attendance, and we'll cut out the bits where you're answering the front door. Don't worry about that.
yeah, don't
Nobody will
worry.
know.
Thanks for
It's
that,
nothing.
Tony. Yeah.
And I'll drop you a note.